I couldn't pass it. I could guess at some of them. There were several. There was time when when the northern kingdom was about to be carried off by the Assyrians, and there were several more that were during the time when the southern kingdom was becoming more and more wicked. But I have lost track on when was each. So that's why I enjoy my chronological Bible. I can kind of put it into place. So we're just going to go through here. I'll give you a few notes on each one of these books. We're going to go through them fairly fast. As I said, these first 5 books are the books of the law of Moses. They are not just law. Leviticus is mostly, but there's a lot of narrative in Genesis, the first half of Exodus. The second half of Exodus is what God told Moses for the Israelites about the feasts, the special days, the offerings, and then the construction of the tabernacle. Leviticus is primarily about the feast. It is kind of like reading a law book, but it's important. Numbers is a lot more narrative. Deuteronomy is essentially Moses giving his farewell address to Israel and reminding them of so much of what was from the days of the Exodus, since this was a whole new generation going into the promised land. So let's take them individually and go through a few things. I started with Genesis last week. Let's review it very quickly before we move on. Genesis takes us back to the beginning of time, the creation. God doesn't tell us when was the creation, but he does give us a genealogy. And many years ago, there was a preacher named Ussher. He was called Bishop Ussher. And he tried to go through and take all the lives of all the individuals and try to figure out how far back the creation was. His conclusion was 4004 BC. Now, that's a reasonable guess. There have been some people say, well, there's 4,000 before Christ, 2,000 after Christ, the millennium makes 7,000, and that works out very neat. Unfortunately, I think that's being a little oversimplistic. In the first place, we've already gone past our 2,000 in the New Testament time. Old Testament time, that would still be 4 years older, but there is a characteristic of Hebrew language that Ussher didn't quite figure out. And that is the simple fact that in Hebrew, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, fathers cannot be the same word. So are we talking the immediate father or the grandfather or his grandfather? We're not sure. But I'm guessing, and this is pure guess, that it's at least 4,000 BC. And if we allow for that in the genealogies, we may push it back 1,000 or 2, maybe 3. But there is no way we're going past 10,000 BC. I just don't see any way possible. Some years ago, the Institute for Creation Research put out a video, and it had, I think, 98 different ways that they measure the age of the universe. None of them go past 100,000 years. None of them. There was only one they had that goes back further than that. Right now, the current number is somewhere in the 4.6 billion years. And that was the concept of evolution, which is really not supported by science on any level. And that's just kind of an aberration. I think we can just pitch out and say that's just not scientifically right. That upsets a lot of atheistic scientists, but frankly, I'm not too worried about them. They're going to have their problems in the day to come. They need to get saved. And I say that genuinely. They need to get saved. So God takes us back to the beginnings. It's very clear to me that the heavens and the earth were created in a 6-day period. God also shows how humanity fell into sin and was driven out of the Garden of Eden by God. And it also describes the flood. What we know about the flood, I think the flood was a much greater event than what we give it credit, and we give it credit for a lot. But I think it was actually much more influential on what happened to Earth than what we generally think of it. He describes the flood, Noah, and all that went with that. He describes the call of Abraham. In fact, Genesis covers a longer period of time than the whole rest of the Bible put together. We're figuring from the time of creation, at least 4000 BC, and we're still at time we get to Joseph, we're about 1200 BC. So that's 2800 years, probably a little bit more. So we move on to Exodus. Oh, by the way, the name Genesis means beginning. Kind of a obvious choice of words. Well, let's talk about the beginning. Exodus means a way out, leaving, a way out. Now, I don't know when God gave Moses these words. Moses, of course, lived Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He, of course, did not live in Genesis, but God told him what happened. And so Exodus, of course, refers to the time when the slaves in Egypt, the Israelites, were led out of Egyptian bondage. They were slaves. And God used Moses to lead them out of Egyptian bondage, the Exodus. And then how he gave Moses the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. If I was to ask you, where are the 10 Commandments in the Bible? The great chapters of the Bible, where would the 10 Commandments be? Exodus 20. Exodus 20. But I'll also accept Deuteronomy 5 because Moses repeated them before they went into the promised land. So Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Exodus also mentions God's detailed instructions about the tabernacle and directions about the priesthood. A couple of thoughts there. The tabernacle, this was not just a random construction that the Israelites came up with. God gave them very, very precise standards to build this tabernacle, and even what kind of wood and what kind of cloth, what kind of hides would be in the construction. For example, the dishes in the Holy of Holies was out of gold. Gold represents divinity. Remember what the wise men brought to the Christ child when he was there in the house after his birth? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. 2 spices used for burial and 1 spice to represent he is God. So gold represents the divinity. In the sockets of the fence around, they're made of silver. What does silver typify? What does it represent? It represents redemption. Because after all, that is our biggest need as sinners, is to be redeemed. Silver represents that. That's no accident. And then the furniture out in the outer courtyard, as you come into the tabernacle proper and you're there in the outer courtyard outside of the holy place, that furniture, the brazen laver and the furniture out there was made of bronze. What does bronze represent? Represents judgment. And so that's where the sacrifices were consumed. And so all of this was a picture of God to the different kinds of hides and how it's all put together. God gives very specific instructions about the tabernacle. Where did God say how to build the tabernacle? The book of Exodus. And he also talks about the priesthood. Aaron became the first chief priest, the brother of Moses. It was the Levitical priesthood. Aaron was a Levite. And so was Moses, for that matter. But God made the priesthood of the Levites, and they became the priests all the way through the Old Testament. And as the Israelites continued into the New Testament, they were of the Levitical priesthood. But in Genesis, Abraham comes to meet with a man called Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a man who had no beginning, no ending, who was above all the king of Salem, which means peace, king of peace. Who was Melchizedek? There are more than a few Bible scholars that believe Melchizedek was Jesus Christ himself. And he appeared to Moses. And so Paul writes about Melchizedek as the great high priest. We are of a priesthood of eternity, of Melchizedek, not of the priesthood of Levi any longer. And so all that's in the book of Exodus. It is a tremendous book. Sometimes it gets a little laborious as we work our way through those specific instructions, but it underscores just how precise God is. He doesn't just throw out very vague guesstimates about, well, it was about so much. No, God is very precise about what he tells us. So Genesis, Exodus brings us to Leviticus, the book of the law, the Levitical priesthood. And in this book, God is primarily dealing with Aaron, the first chief priest, first Levitical priest, and his sons. It includes material on the consecration of the priest and an example of those who take God lightly. Nadab and Abihu, two of Aaron's sons, I believe he had four, but two of them were Nadab and Abihu, were struck dead for not following the instructions that God gave concerning the fire on the altar. They were struck dead. Sometimes in modern culture, people make some comment or comical remark about, I hope God doesn't strike me dead. He has a reputation for that. It's a pretty serious offense when God does. But the atheist that shakes his hand in God's face and said, I dare you to kill me, might get his wish. So it's not something to take lightly, and Leviticus emphasizes that. Leviticus closes with regulations about property dedicated to God. It is essentially a law book. When I was a mayor, we had to read the law books on occasion. They are dull, they are dry, they are in lawyerese. It's like trying to read, a lawyer cannot take Dick and Jan ran to school. A sentence like that carries 48 paragraphs in legalese. God spells it down very precisely, very quickly, but the law is still the law, and it can be a little laborious to work your way through it. I would urge you not to skip over Leviticus for the simple fact, though it is a little tougher reading, it gives you the reason for a lot of things God did in the New Testament. They have their origin in Leviticus. All the sacrifices represent specific things about the gospel. All the different types of offerings, all the type of feasts, all the type of special days, all of those find their origin in the book of Leviticus. And in fact, the New Testament book that most clearly matches Leviticus would be Hebrews. Paul, I think it's Paul, it could have been anybody, but the author of Hebrews takes what God said in Leviticus and says, we have a better priest. We have a better offering. We have a better covenant. We have a better everything. And so Hebrews is kind of the fulfillment of what Leviticus was setting up. Numbers. The book of Numbers receives its name from the census. It literally is what it's about. Counting of the people. In chapter 3, verse 15, there is a census of Israel that is taken. If I recall, the number of men capable of war was some 600,000 and change. That's how we get some idea of how big the nation of Israel was in these days. Remember when Jacob, then Israel, and his sons came down to Egypt where Joseph was. There were some 70 that went. 430 years later, when Moses led them out, there were these 600,000 men of war. So from 70 people to perhaps 2.5 to 3 million people in 400 years. Yes, that's very possible. For example, in the United States, 1600, there were almost no white men here. There were the Native Americans. 1607, John Smith came to Virginia, and ultimately Jamestown began. It had some very difficult early years. I actually had ancestors that came through there. They came in 1611. 1620, the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts. By 1630, there were probably 50,000 Americans or white people, Europeans in America. Today, 400 years later, we have 330 million here from all over the world now. So yeah, it's very, very possible to go from 70 to 3 million in 400 years, especially when you've got so many of these families. It wasn't just Billy and Sally. They may have 12, 13, 15 kids. John Wesley in the 1600s, he was child 15, I think it was, out of 22, I think it was. So large families. And with that said, only 5 of them made it to adulthood. That was one of the reasons there were so many kids. It took all the family to work the land. And the reality was many of them are not going to make it to adulthood either. So Numbers, it is one of the 5 books of the law, but it's actually more history than it is legislation. It deals with the nation's 40 years in the wilderness, the result of the people's fear and unbelief when God prevented them from entering into the promised land. The trip from Egypt to Sinai was just a matter of a few days. From Sinai to Canaan, it was a matter of a week and a half or so. They could have been in the promised land in less than 2 weeks. But God stopped at Sinai for a year. That was his timing. But then they wanted up to the promised land. And of course, we know the story of how the people spied out the land. 10 of them came back and said, we can't beat the big giants there. The other 2, Caleb and Joshua, said, yes, we can. God's bigger than they are. But the people rejected their report, took the report of the 10, and God sent them back into the wilderness for their unbelief until that entire generation passed away. You're considered an adult in Israel at 20. At 60, you're considered senior. Everyone over the age of 20 died. It took 40 years for that whole generation to pass away. So now at Numbers, they're back there at the end, and most of the book is about that time in the wilderness, 40 years that really should have never happened. Unfortunately, it's also a picture of so many lives in the Christian world. There are things that we go through, trials that we go through that really shouldn't have happened, but bad choices, lack of faith, listening to the wrong people can always cause detours along the way. Unfortunately, it happens quite often. And then Deuteronomy, Moses' 3 discourses. This particular author says it's 3. Some have said it's just one long 36 chapter oration. If that would have been the case, 36 chapters, read 36 chapters, that's probably 4 or 5 hours. Probably not all at one time. And since there were 3 million of them out there, Moses would have had a very difficult time to talk to all of 3 million people. So it was probably a few. This author says 3, maybe it was 5, I don't know. But nonetheless, Moses gives his discourses to the nation, and then his death is recorded at the end of the book. He does not go into the promised land because of a sin of disobedience he committed in Numbers. But he, as the great leader of Israel, been their leader for 40 years, he talks about their past, their present, their future. And then he appoints Joshua as the next leader of Israel and exhorts the people to be strong in the Lord. That's chapter 31. Then Moses gives a long song in chapter 32, and then he blesses the tribes in chapter 33. And that final chapter is Moses' journey up Mount Nebo in Moab, where he died. We had the opportunity to go to Moab. We got a chance to see Mount Nebo. It's not too far away from the city of Amman, capital of Jordan. And it's kind of a high, you kind of have the valley of the River Jordan, which is low land below sea level. And then you've got kind of a ridge of increasingly high hills, mountains, several thousand feet. And Nebo is one of the mid-range there. And so you can get up through there and look across from Mount Nebo across the valley of Jordan River. and you can see where Jericho is. It's a pretty dramatic sight, in fact, not terribly far from the River Jordan. Moses was buried there. Nobody has any idea where. If you see the area, it's like trying to find a body somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. Not likely to be found anytime soon. So that brings us to the end of the books of the law. The books of the history, the books of the law cover from Genesis, creation, all the way up to about 1300 BC. There is some archaeological argument about when exactly was Moses. Some will put him back as far back as 1500 BC. Others will go as close as 1200 BC. I'm going to split the difference and say somewhere around 1300 to 1400 BC. And so we're talking at least 2,500 years plus the book of Genesis to the book of Deuteronomy. Now we pick up from the books of history. We've already read a bunch of history in the book of law. Exodus, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, all have a great deal of history, and Deuteronomy is a rehashing of some of it. So now we're past Deuteronomy and we go to the books of history. These books cover a period of about 1,000 years, from about 1400 BC to about 400 BC. About 1,000 years altogether. They start where Deuteronomy leaves off. They start with the conquest of the promised land that God gave promise to Abraham they would have. It ends with the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Samuel was the prophet and the leader. The people demanded a king. God gave them Saul. He turned out to not be such a good leader. And God anointed David to be the next king. David is arguably the greatest king in Israel. And the descendants of the southern kingdom are all descendants of David. After David, his son Solomon was the king. After Solomon was the king, his son Rehoboam was going to be the king. Rehoboam was completely unprepared to be a king. He was a very immature man. He had very poor counsel. He was a very arrogant man. You go down the list of what a king should not be, he had just about every box checked. And in his failure to have the wisdom he needed, in fact, he was about opposite of Solomon as he could be, but in his incompetence, his rebellion, his arrogance, the 10 northern tribes rebelled against him. They picked a guy who was actually worse than Rehoboam and made him their king. His name was Jeroboam. And so after Solomon, there's a divided kingdom. That stayed for a while. Eventually, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians. They came in and took the people, and we don't know where they went. We really don't have a good idea. There's several possibilities. We don't know which ones it might be. And then about 120 years later, Babylon conquered Assyria, who took all of Assyria's land, and they moved on the southern kingdom. And that's when the history books end, after that capture. I take that back. That's when the captivity began, 70 years there. Some of the prophets talked about that. And then we get into the rebuilding coming back and the phase of the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem, rebuilding of the temple. And so the whole period is about 1,000 years, from Moses till we get to Malachi, about 1,000 years. They started with the conquest of the promised land, the division of the kingdom, and then the books are basically narrative accounts, history accounts of what took place. The first one is Joshua. We've already talked about him quite a bit in the books of the law. The book of Joshua is the story of the successor to Moses. His name, Joshua, led the nation in conquering and possessing the land of Canaan. They had many victories, but ultimately they did not completely accomplish their goal. They allowed some of those Canaanites to remain in the land. There's a difference between mercy and self-defeat. Their failure to exile these Canaanites from the land actually caused the Israelites many, many serious problems. So Joshua leads the nation in possessing the land as much as they did. Just for the record, the Israelites have never yet possessed all the land God promised them. They will, but they have not yet. They did not in the days of David. In the days of Solomon, the kingdom expanded a little further, but it's been reduced dramatically over history since that time. They have never possessed the entire land that God promised to them. So the first victory was at Jericho. Ai was a place of defeat because of the sin and disobedience of a soldier named Achan. Joshua first struck through the center of the land. He defeated the south, and then he moved in and defeated the north. At his death, Israel was in the promised land with the majority of the land possessed and more conquering yet to complete. Sometimes the book of Joshua is likened to the victorious Christian life. The victorious Christian life has defeats in it sometimes. And we also have a land to possess in our spiritual growth. And sad to say, that's seldom accomplished as much as it could be in each of our lives as well. So it's also got kind of that significance as well. Brings us to the Judges. In many ways, this was the low point in the history and the early part of the history. Judges were ruling the promised land. They were not like judges that we would consider in the court system of the United States. They were more like seers, wise men, people who made decisions. They were kind of recognized as the de facto leaders in certain areas for a certain time. There was no judge in the period of Judges that covered the entire land. None of them were national. There were several regional guys in the land. Israel is not a huge country. It is about 120 miles long. It's about 80 miles wide at its widest point. You could fit Israel between the Mississippi and Interstate 35 and have most of the land left over. It is not a huge place. But these judges were regional. Maybe the judge of Cedar Rapids, the judge of Northeast, maybe the judge of Oskaloosa. They were regional judges. And the book of Judges describes their exploits. They functioned more like generals than judges of our day. During the 300 years covered in the book of Judges, Israel went through multiple cycles. It went from peace, apostasy, oppression, repentance, deliverance, and peace. Rinse and do it again. Rinse and do it again. And some say 7 cycles in there. Again, peace, apostasy. That's kind of where we are in the United States right now. Kind of moving from apostasy to oppression, to repentance, to deliverance, to peace. There are 12 judges mentioned, some in great detail, some in just a few verses. The key verse of the book is Judges 21:25. It was a time when every man did that was right in his own eyes. That's a scary picture when everybody does what's right in their own eyes. There are a lot of people that have very poor judgment. There's a lot of people who do not know God, and so their judgment is even worse. And so it was a very dark day in the times of the Judges. The last 5 chapters of Judges describe the religious, the social, the political confusion of the day. Overall, Israel digresses in its relationship with God through this period of the Judges. They actually go backwards significantly. These several periods of these cycles, they just keep going lower and lower and lower and lower. It is about as low as they got before there was a king. And then there was a lot of dark days during those days as well. So then we throw in the book of Ruth. Yes, it's considered a history book. It is a history of one small family, but it does have some very pertinent history. It follows Judges in the order of the Bible. It actually took place during the time of the Judges. It was just kind of a parenthetical insertion there that in the middle of these some chapters of Judges, we put this short little book about one particular family. It does present a bright side of the period of the Judges. It describes the grace of God through a remnant that feared God, people that were believers. Ruth who was actually not an Israelite. Her mother-in-law was, her husband was. Ruth was not an Israelite. She was from Moab, which is, if you visualize the land of Israel between the Mediterranean, I'm trying to do this backwards, from the Mediterranean to Israel to the Jordan River, there are three countries here on the east side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. From top to bottom, it's Ammon, Moab, and Edom. And so Ruth came from the country in the middle, Moab. And so she was not an Israelite, but she chose to worship the God of Israel. She was a convert. And she worked to provide for her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi, who of course was an Israelite. Ultimately, in the book's only 4 chapters. Ultimately, in the book, Ruth married a man named Boaz, a rich Israelite from the tribe of Judah. That should ring a bell. From the tribe of Judah, and became actually in the ancestral tree of David and ultimately of Christ. So you go down through history. You have Ruth from Moab marries a man from Judah, and ultimately down through the line, you'll get to David. And of course, the Christ child, Jesus, is a descendant genealogically of David, ultimately from Ruth, his ancestral tree goes. So there's a picture there of God providing through one who is not a native Jewish person. That brings us to the Kings and Chronicles. That clock is not giving me much room. We'll continue those next week. The books of history, and then we'll talk about the books of poetry. We have covered 8 chapters, 8 books already. That's not too shabby. I don't think I've ever done 8 books of the Bible in one sitting, but we'll continue that and look at the history books that will come after that. So let's take a break. We'll give you a few extra minutes this morning and get some coffee, stretch, fellowship. What is today? There we go. And we'll get started in about 15 minutes.